The usher held up one hand before he reached the top of the steps. Not a dramatic gesture. Not aggressive. Just the flat, practiced palm of someone whose job was to stop certain people before certain people became a problem, and who had developed over time the specific efficiency of someone who made that assessment quickly and acted on it without ceremony. The man at the top of the steps was wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit him well and said nothing about itself. A white shirt, no tie, and shoes that had been polished recently and carefully. He was carrying a slim leather portfolio under one arm. Beside him, holding his other hand with the relaxed ease of a child who had been to events before and knew the rhythm of them, was his 12-year-old daughter, Cleo, wearing a deep blue dress, and the expression of a child who was taking in everything around her with the systematic pleasure of someone who had learned that new places were worth paying attention to. The venue was the Callaway Institute, a private architectural foundation that held its annual recognition ceremony in its own building, a converted 19th-century printing house in the old civic quarter of the city that had been renovated 15 years ago by a firm whose name Cleo had heard her father say with the specific quality he used for things he considered important. Tonight, the Institute was giving its highest honor, the Meridian Award, to a building. The building was the Ashford Community Arts Center, a mid-sized public building on the east side of the city that had opened 3 years ago to the kind of reception that did not happen often, the kind where the reviews and the public response and the experience of the people actually using the building had all said the same thing at the same time, which was that something had been built that was exactly what it needed to be. The man who had designed it was standing at the top of the Institute steps being told by a usher with a flat palm that he needed to stop. "Good evening," the usher said, in the tone of someone who did not mean good evening as a greeting, but as a boundary. "This is a private ceremony this evening. Invitation only. Do you have your invitation card?" The man's name was Leon Ashby. He was 44 years old, and he had been an architect for 18 years, and he had never once in those 18 years stood at the entrance of an event honoring his own work and been asked to prove he had the right to enter it. He had not brought his invitation card because it had been inside the portfolio he had been carrying when he left his office, and the portfolio had been left in the back of the car when he helped Cleo navigate the steps in her dress shoes, and he had not thought about the portfolio again until this moment. He said, "I don't have the card on me. My name is Leon Ashby. I'm the architect of the Ashford Center." The usher looked at him, not with malice, not with hostility, just with the particular flatness of someone whose instruction set did not include a provision for the claim that had just been made and who was therefore defaulting to the provision that did exist. He said, "I'm afraid I can't allow entry without an invitation card or a confirmed name on the guest list. It's a closed event." Leon said, "My name is on the guest list." The usher said, "Could you spell that for me?" Leon spelled it. The usher looked at a printed sheet on the small lectern beside him and ran his finger down it with the patience of someone who expected not to find what he was looking for. He looked up. "I'm not seeing it on this sheet," he said. "Do you have another form of identification? A badge from the Institute or a speaker credential?" Leon said, "I'm not a speaker tonight. I'm the recipient. The Ashford Center is receiving the Meridian Award this evening. I designed it." The usher's expression did not change in any way that suggested this information had produced a revision of his position. He said, "I understand. But without a card or a confirmed listing, I'm not able to let you through. Our instructions are very clear on that." Cleo had been standing beside her father looking at the usher with the specific quality of attention she brought to situations she was trying to understand. She was not a child who said things without thinking about them first, and she had been thinking about this one since the usher's hand went up. She said to her father, quietly but not inaudibly, "Is your building in there?" Leon looked at her. He said, "Yes." She looked at the door. She said, "And they're giving it an award tonight?" He said, "That's what the ceremony is for." She thought about this. She looked at the usher. She said, "Can we at least wait here while someone checks?" The usher looked at her. Something in his expression adjusted very slightly, not enough to be called softening, but enough to be called an acknowledgement that a 12-year-old had just asked a reasonable question in a reasonable way and deserved a reasonable response. He said, "I can call inside." One moment. He produced a small radio and made a call. The call lasted about 40 seconds. He listened more than he spoke. Then he put the radio away and looked at Leon with an expression that had changed from flat management into something more careful. He said, "Someone from the Institute is coming out to speak with you." Leon said, "Thank you." They waited at the top of the steps. Cleo stood beside her father and looked at the building they were standing in front of. At its 19th century stone facade and the careful lighting that had been installed during the renovation to make the building visible at night without overwhelming the architecture. She had heard her father talk about this building before. He had said once that whoever had renovated it had understood something important, which was that the building was already making an argument and the renovation's job was to support that argument rather than replace it with a new one. She had remembered that because it was the kind of thing her father said that she did not fully understand yet but could feel the weight of, and she had a practice of keeping the things she could feel the weight of until the understanding arrived. She said, "Who renovated this building?" Leon said, "A firm called Marsh and Holt. 15 years ago." She said, "Did they do it right?" He looked at the building. He said, "Yes." They understood what they had. She nodded. She filed it. She went back to looking at the facade. The person who came from the Institute arrived 4 minutes later. She came through the main door with the specific energy of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something and had chosen to deal with the interruption personally rather than delegate it. She was in her mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who ran an institution and had been doing so for long enough that the authority was no longer performed, but simply present. Her name was Dr. Edith Crane, and she was the executive director of the Callaway Institute, and she had known Leon Ashby for 11 years, not as a close colleague, but as a professional acquaintance whose work she had followed and respected and had been responsible, as the chair of the selection committee, for deciding to honor tonight. She saw him at the top of the steps, and the expression on her face moved through several things in rapid succession, none of which she attempted to conceal, because she was not a person who concealed things when concealing them served no useful purpose. She said, "Leon." She said it the way you said someone's name when you were also saying, "I understand what has happened here and I am sorry for it." He said, "Edith." She looked at the usher with the brief, complete look of someone who would be having a different conversation with that person later. Then she looked back at Leon and said, "Please come in, both of you." She looked at Cleo. "You must be Cleo. Your father has mentioned you." Cleo looked at her with the assessment she brought to new adults. She said, "What did he say?" Edith said, "That you ask better questions than most architects he knows." Cleo considered this. She said, "That's accurate." Edith almost smiled. She held the door, and they went in. The interior of the Callaway Institute was the kind of room that happened when people who cared about architecture were given the chance to renovate a building they also cared about. The printing house bones were visible and honored, the industrial details kept and reframed rather than hidden. The light from the high windows allowed to do what light from high windows did when you did not fight it. The renovation had been done with the specific intelligence of people who understood that restraint was a form of generosity, that knowing what not to do was as important as knowing what to do. Cleo walked into it and did what she always did in rooms that deserved it, which was stop and look. She said, "They kept the ceiling." Leon said, "They did." She said, "It would have been easy to drop a new one. Lower the space. Make it feel more like a regular room." He said, "Yes." She said, "But they didn't." He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He thought about this. He said, "Because the ceiling was the best thing about the space, and the best designers know that the best thing about a space is not yours to change. Your job is to understand it and build around it." Cleo looked at the ceiling for another moment. She said, "Is that what you did with the Ashford Center? Find the best thing and build around it?" Leon said, "I tried to." She said, "What was the best thing?" He thought about the site as he had first seen it. a piece of land on the east side that had been a community garden for 20 years, before the city allocated it for the Arts Center project. He thought about the quality of the light on that site in the afternoon, the way it came from the west at a specific angle that he had tracked for 6 months before he began the design. He thought about the decision he had made early, which was that the building was going to be organized around that light, that every room in it was going to have a relationship to it, that the people inside it were going to feel the afternoon without having to be told they were feeling it. He said, the light, the way the afternoon came onto that site from the west. Everything else was built to serve that. Cleo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you tell when a building has been built around something real versus built around what looked good?" Leon looked at his daughter. He said, "Yes, you can always tell." She said, "How?" He said, "The real ones make you feel something you didn't expect to feel. The other ones make you feel like you're supposed to feel something. The difference is in whether the emotion arrives or is prompted." Cleo held this for a moment. Then she said, "Like tonight." At the door, he looked at her. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The usher was doing the thing where you're supposed to feel a certain way because of the situation. Like you're supposed to feel small because someone with a list doesn't have your name on it. But you didn't feel that. You just waited." Leon looked at his daughter. He said, "No, I didn't feel that." She said, "Because you knew what you built." He said, "Yes." She said, "And knowing what you built meant the situation at the door couldn't change what was true." He said, "That's exactly right." She nodded. She had filed it. They moved further into the institute toward the ceremony space where the guests were assembled, and the evening was about to begin. Edith fell into step beside Leon as they crossed the entrance hall. She said, "The communication failure was in the printing of the guest list. Your name was on the digital registry, but the printed sheet the ushers were given was generated from an earlier version." She said this plainly, the way she said things, without softening them or dressing them up. "It's an administrative failure, and it shouldn't have happened, and it won't happen again." Leon said, "I know it won't." She said, "I want you to know that Marcus, the usher, was doing exactly what he was trained to do. The failure is systemic, not individual," Leon said. "I understood that at the door." Edith looked at him. She said, "Most people wouldn't have." He said, "Most people haven't spent 18 years being the person whose name wasn't on the expected list." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I want to talk to you about that after the ceremony. Not about tonight specifically. About something broader." He said, "I'll be here." The ceremony space was the Institute's main hall, a large room that had been the original printing floor, with its full height and its industrial bones and its carefully renovated surfaces all intact and honored. It held approximately 200 people, all of them in the specific world of architecture and design, people who had spent their careers caring about the built environment and who were gathered tonight to honor something they had collectively decided was worth honoring. Leon and Cleo were shown to seats in the third row. Cleo sat down and looked at the room, and then at the program she had been handed, and then at her father. She said, "You're the last award of the evening." He said, "The Meridian Award is always last." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's the most significant. You save the most significant thing for when people are most ready to receive it." She thought about this. She said, "Or when people have the most patience." He said, "Also that," she said. "How long will the others take?" He said, "About an hour. Maybe more." She said, "I have questions." He said, "About what?" She said, "Everything. I want to understand how the awards work, and who decides, and what the criteria are, and whether you think they get it right most of the time." Leon looked at his daughter with her program and her questions, and her 12-year-old readiness to spend an hour at an architecture ceremony extracting from it everything it contained. He said, "We'll go through all of it." She said, "Good. Starting now." She pointed at the first entry in the program. "What is this one for?" He said, "A residential project, a single-family house on the coast. The firm who designed it is very well regarded for work at that scale." She said, "Have you seen it?" He said, "In photographs." "Not in person?" She said, "Does that count?" He thought about it. He said, "Photographs tell you what a building looks like. Being inside one tells you what it is." They're not the same thing, she said, so you don't fully know if it deserves the award. He said, no. None of us fully know until we've been inside it. She said, but you give the award anyway. He said, you make the best judgment you can with the information available. That's all any decision is. She said, that seems like a limitation in the process. He said, it is. She said, has anyone fixed it? He said, no one's figured out how to yet. She looked at the program. She said, you should work on that. He said, I'll add it to the list. The ceremony began. It moved through its program with the specific rhythm of professional events that have been run many times before. The speeches and the presentations and the acknowledgments and the moments of genuine feeling interspersed between the moments of practiced ceremony. Cleo watched all of it with full attention and asked Leon questions between segments in a voice low enough for the surrounding seats not to hear, and he answered them with the seriousness they deserved, which was the seriousness of someone being asked real questions by someone genuinely trying to understand. An hour and 12 minutes into the ceremony, the presenter for the Meridian Award took the lectern. She was an architect in her late 60s, whose career had been one of the most significant of her generation, and she spoke about the Ashford Community Arts Center for 7 minutes with the specific authority of someone who had been inside the building and knew what it was. She said it had been built around a truth about its site that most architects would have ignored because ignoring it would have been easier, and the result would have looked fine and no one would have known the difference. She said the afternoon light in the main gathering hall was one of the most considered pieces of design she had encountered in 20 years of awards work. She said the building had been designed for the people who would use it rather than the people who would photograph it, and that this was rarer than it should be and more important than most people acknowledged. She said the architect was Leon Ashby, and she called his name. Cleo turned and looked at her father with the expression she wore when something she had understood theoretically was becoming concrete in front of her. Leon stood. He walked to the lectern. He stood in front of 200 people who spent their lives caring about the built environment, and he spoke for 4 minutes about the afternoon, light on the East Side site and what it had required of him and what he had tried to give it. He spoke without notes because he had been thinking about this for 3 years, and the thinking had become fluent enough not to require them. He spoke about the community garden that had been there before, about the people who had tended it, about the decision he had made that the building should remember the garden even though the garden was gone, and how that decision had shaped the entrance sequence and the internal courtyard and the way the building met the ground. He did not speak about the door. He did not speak about the usher or the guest list or the 8 minutes they had spent at the top of the steps in the cool evening air. That was not what this moment was for, and he knew, with the clarity he had developed over 18 years of decisions about what to include and what to leave out, that this moment was for the building and the light and the people who used the building and felt the light without being told they were feeling it. He accepted the award. He held it and looked at it, and then he looked at the third row where Cleo was, sitting with both hands in her lap and the expression of a person who was receiving something she was going to hold for a very long time. He went back to his seat. She did not say anything immediately. She sat with the evening for a moment, the way she sat with things that were large enough to require time before they could be put into words. Then she said, "The thing you said about the garden? About the building remembering it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I could feel that. When you said it, before I knew what you meant by it technically, I could feel that it was the right decision." Leon looked at his daughter. He said, "That's the test." She said, "What test?" He said, "Whether the thing you built makes people feel something real before they understand it technically. The feeling should arrive before the explanation. If it only makes sense after you've explained it, you haven't built it correctly." Cleo sat with this. She said, "Like the ceiling in this room." He said, "Exactly like the ceiling." She said, "And the afternoon light in your building." He said, "Yes." She looked at the award in his hands. She said, "Can I hold it?" He handed it to her. She took it with both hands and looked at it and turned it over and looked at the back of it and set it on her knee and looked at the front of it again. She said, "It's heavy," he said. "Good things usually are." She held it for another moment. Then she handed it back. She said, "I'm going to design buildings." He had known this for approximately 4 years and had been waiting for her to say it. He said, "I know." She said, "Will you teach me?" He said, "Everything I know," she said, "starting with the light," he said, "always starting with the light." They stayed for the reception. Cleo moved through it with the focused attention of someone who had decided this was an educational event and was extracting from it accordingly. She spoke to 3 architects, 2 of whom she surprised with the precision of her questions, and one of whom gave her his card and said she should call him when she was ready to think about university programs. She held the card with both hands the way she had held the award and put it carefully in the small purse she had brought for the evening. On the way out, they passed the usher who had stopped them at the door. He was still at his post, managing the departure of guests with the same efficiency he had brought to the arrival. He looked at Leon as they passed. He said, "Congratulations, sir." He said it with the specific quality of someone who understood what he was saying more fully now than he would have 3 hours earlier. Leon said, "Thank you." He meant it without complication. Cleo said nothing. She looked at the usher for a moment with the expression of someone who had filed the beginning of the evening and the end of it and was deciding what the distance between them meant. Then she looked at her father, and they walked out through the door and down the steps into the night. At the bottom of the steps, he said, "Congratulations." Leon said, "Yes," she said. "Because now he knows," he said. "Now he knows." She said, "Does it matter that he knows now?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "It matters that the truth arrived. It matters less how it arrived." She thought about this. She said, "Because the building was always what it was. Whether he knew who designed it or not?" He said, "Yes, exactly that." She said, "The award didn't change the building." He said, "No. The building was already what it was before tonight," she said. "Tonight just made it visible to more people." He said, "That's all tonight did?" She nodded. She took his hand. They walked through the old civic quarter toward the car, through streets that were quiet now and lit in the specific way of city streets late in an evening when the commerce had settled and what remained was the city being itself. Cleo walked beside her father and held his hand and thought about light and buildings and the garden that a building could remember and the feeling that arrived before the understanding. She thought about the usher's flat palm and her father not moving from that stillness, waiting without shrinking, certain of what he had built in the specific way that a person was certain of something they had spent 3 years making with full attention and care. She thought about starting with the light. She thought about what it would mean to spend a life finding the true thing about a site and building around it. Building to serve something real rather than to produce something that looked right. She thought she would like that kind of life very much. The car was at the corner. Leon opened the door for her and she got in and he got in, and the city moved around them as they drove home through it. Lit and continuous and full of buildings built by people whose names were not always known and whose light was not always acknowledged and whose work stood regardless, doing what it had been built to do, making people feel something true before they understood why. That was the work. That had always been the work. And Cleo Ashby, age 12, in a deep blue dress with a business card in her purse and the weight of a real award still in her palms, had just decided she was going to spend her life doing it. Leon drove home and thought that was the best thing that had happened all evening, better even than the award. He did not say this to her. He drove and she looked out the window at the city, and he looked at the road in the evening, settled around them with the specific quality of evenings that had been full and were now becoming quiet. He thought about the building, about the afternoon light, about the 3 years between the first site visit and the opening day ceremony, the 3 years of decisions made and revised and made again, of problems solved at the level of their actual difficulty rather than their apparent difficulty, of the understanding that the best architecture was not the kind that solved visible problems, but the kind that solved the problems the occupants would feel without ever being able to name. He had spent 18 years trying to understand what that meant. He thought he was getting closer. He thought about what Edith had said after the ceremony. They had found 10 minutes in the corner of the reception, the two of them with glasses of water in a room full of people, and she had said, "I want to talk to you about a commission, not through the Institute. Something I'm working on personally. A small residential project, unusual site conditions, the kind of problem that I think requires someone who starts with the light." He had said, "Tell me about the site." She had. She had spoken for 6 minutes about a piece of land she owned on the northern coast. A site with a particular relationship to the water and to the sky and to the morning, a site that had been waiting for someone to understand what it was before doing anything to it. He had listened to all 6 minutes. Then he had said, "I'd like to see it." She had said, "I was hoping you'd say that." He thought about that site now, driving through the city. Its coordinates somewhere in the information Edith had given him, its light unknowable from here but already present as a question he was beginning to form. This was how it always began. Not with a commission or a contract or a meeting in a conference room. With a question about light.